Good afternoon and welcome to our latest live event on the European Parliament Facebook and LinkedIn pages. In today's interview, we'll be discussing the outcome of the US presidential election and the future of transatlantic relations. Our guest is the chair of Parliament's US delegation. A very warm welcome, Radosław Sikorski.
Hello.
Before we get underway, I'd like to remind our viewers, both on LinkedIn and on Facebook, to please post your comments and questions to Mr. Sikorski. I'll be keeping an eye on them and we'll put as many of them as possible to Mr. Sikorski in the coming 25 minutes, half an hour or so. Mr. Sikorski, you're a former foreign affairs minister, a former defense minister. You've had a distinguished career in academia and in journalism on both sides of the Atlantic. So you have a good understanding of the United States, of the transatlantic relationship. As things currently stand, about over 24 hours since polling finished, what's your understanding of the current state of play in the US election?
If this were a normal election between traditional candidates, I would be very guarded in my comments and be saying that we, of course, want the best possible relations with whoever wins and we should wait for the official results. But this is not an ordinary election because we have an incumbent who has called us, the European Union, a foe and who's intervened brutally in our internal affairs, for example, by backing Brexit and Mr. Farage. I don't think he can win. I think given the overwhelming advantage that Joe Biden has in the popular vote, and in the electors, and counting the dynamics in the remaining swing states, I think that Joe Biden is coasting to victory.
So I'd like to get back to the ins and outs of the election results maybe a bit later in the interview, but firstly, let's move directly onto transatlantic relations. Compared to the US, compared to the EU, the US has been taking a more unilateral approach to world affairs. The European Union relies more on multilateral relations, on international bodies like the UN to resolve issues. If Joe Biden does end up in the White House, do you expect a change to this, a return to the more multilateral approach from the United States?
Yes, I do. Because Joe Biden is an old school Atlanticist. I think he'll be even more interested in Europe than Barack Obama was, who had his interest in Africa and his pivot to Asia. Some of what you described correctly is, of course, structural. The United States is a nation state. We are a confederation. And the United States has a strong military, which we don't. So they have a propensity to try to solve problems with their greatest asset. We don't have that choice. But yes, I think Joe Biden will want to collaborate much better with the European Union and in general with democratic allies for whom Donald Trump had an obvious distaste.
Let's move to the climate crisis, an example of the change in the US position in the world. The United States officially withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement yesterday, rather coincidentally. Are you worried that the US withdrawal from this agreement will encourage or will see other countries adopt a go-slow attitude towards climate action? Or do you think that if Joe Biden opts back into the Paris Climate Agreement in January, that we might see the damage undone, the damage of the last 4 years?
I don't follow the science of this day by day, but it has to be the case that the deep recession that we are all experiencing means smaller economic output and therefore smaller energy output and therefore less emissions. So some of our emissions targets should be easier to reach. The European Commission, as you know, is recommending 55% as a target. And in the US, I think there's been a drop in emissions too. But I think Biden will have a different attitude to all kinds of institutions. Namely, he will want to maximize US influence in them, both in the various treaties and in the United Nations system. Whereas President Trump pretended that he was winning by just withdrawing from the world. And others, of course, were filling in the void, the Russians and the Chinese.
Of course, the Paris Agreement is just one example of US disengagement in international affairs, yet this is perhaps nothing new. I want to give a quote, to mention a quote from George Washington from over 2 centuries ago. He spoke of a desire to avoid foreign entanglements. With America possibly on the retreat, is it time for Europe to take up the mantle of a world leader, or are we already doing so, in fact?
Well, steady on. We are not even fulfilling the strong wording of the Lisbon Treaty, in which we pledged ourselves to conduct our foreign policy in common. Name me one issue in foreign affairs in which the EU is in the lead, in which the member states have allowed the High Representative and the President of the Council to carry out our jointly agreed policy. No, we agree some things in Brussels, and then major states conduct their policy in parallel. That's not a recipe for effectiveness, and it's certainly not a recipe for global leadership. And if you want to be a global leader, I couldn't agree more that we should. You have to have the traditional palette of instruments. We are a superpower in regulation, in economic assistance, in humanitarian assistance, but we are not serious about defense. And the Commission's initial budgetary proposals of 13 billion for 7 years, which was not great, but a good beginning, has been halved during the current discussions. At the European Parliament, at the Defense Subcommittee, I'm proposing that we at least bring back the Commission's original proposals.
On defense, let's talk in particular about NATO. What state do you think the NATO transatlantic partnership is in following 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House? And could a Biden presidency get us back to the situation we were in 4 years ago?
Well, Trump was, of course, right when he castigated some member states for not spending the agreed 2% of GDP on defense. I even agreed with his style, because when Bush and Obama were saying the same thing politely, many Europeans ignored it and didn't do anything about it. This is beginning to change, but glacially. I think Joe Biden will want to collaborate in the more traditional way, and will want to have a serious allied discussion with us on what to do about the more assertive China. It's not a NATO issue, because NATO does not act in the Far East, but we have both interests in common in the industrial field, in the investment field, in the setting of standards field, and but the US also has a system of alliances out there. This requires a conversation for which Donald Trump was uniquely unsuited, because he managed to offend most European leaders and was showing disdain to our joint institutions.
In terms of managing to offend most European leaders, I was just looking at some of his quotes from the past couple of years. I'll see if I can try and find them here. He, for example, called the the European Union a foe. I believe that was when he and Mr. Putin had a summit in Helsinki. He has, on the other hand, described. He said also, for example, that nobody treats us worse than the European Union. On the other hand, he has described the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un as a great leader. He called Turkish President Erdogan a friend of mine and somebody who was doing a great job, while Chinese leader Xi Jinping was described as a very, very good man. We, on the other hand, were described as a foe, as I said. Do you think that we should pay attention to remarks like this? Are they emblematic of a weakened transatlantic relationship, or are they all just a bit of bluster?
Well, of course they are. At the Helsinki press conference with President Putin, what alarmed us in Central Europe even more was that he said that he trusted Vladimir Putin more than he trusted the FBI. And this was after Putin changed borders by force in Europe. Can you imagine how trustful we are to give us the nuclear umbrella, if need be, from a president who trusts President Putin? No, this has been a diplomatic disaster. I just look at the results of the diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, and somehow Iran hasn't caved to President Trump either. So I think Joe Biden, who is an experienced statesman, will start mending many of those frayed relationships.
On the US's role in the world, the EU role in the world, we have some comments from our social media platforms. Matthias from Alto Adige in Italy says the EU needs to be more independent from the US, regardless of who wins the election. Philippe in the UK says, whatever the result, Europe must become more self-sufficient. Tommaso in Parma, Italy says, I really hope Europe will grow more independent from the United States in the future. While Vanessa from Romania says we need cooperation on global issues such as climate change and disinformation. Maybe we'll discuss disinformation a little bit later in the interview. I'd like now to move on to the issue of Brexit. President Trump, of course, has aligned himself with figures like Nigel Farage, and he supported the Brexit even ahead of the 2016 referendum. On the other hand, Joe Biden has repeatedly said that he will not allow peace in Northern Ireland, peace on the island of Ireland, to become a casualty of Brexit. Do you think a Biden presidency will be a blow to Westminster's Brexit ambitions?
It shouldn't be, because what President Biden is simply saying is that Britain should stick to the withdrawal agreement that she voluntarily entered into, and then the peace in Northern Ireland and the non-existence of a physical border across the island can be preserved. But I have to say that after promising more British sovereignty, Britain is finding itself in a position in which Ireland, as a member state, has more influence in Brussels now, and it looks like it has more influence in Washington too.
Moving on to trade, the US and the EU account for about half of global GDP, close to 40% of world trade and services. The trading relationship between the two parties has really been, it has had its ups and downs in the past 4 years, perhaps even before the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency. What should Europe expect from an American trade policy following these elections, particularly if, as it looks now, Joe Biden will be the occupant of the White House?
Well, of course, President Trump had this ill-informed and old-fashioned 1960s style obsession with the visible trade. When you take in the entire relationship, both physical trade in goods and services, where, of course, American tech giants make a lot of money in Europe, it's broadly in balance. And we have the greatest number of cross-investments as well. But there will be issues. There are some issues from the past, like the disputes on public assistance to Boeing and Airbus. These should be resolved, because this is about a few $1 billion 15 years ago, at a time when we are shoveling hundreds of billions to our enterprises to shield them from the pandemic. There are some sanctions, counter sanctions. Some are justified, some are not. There are issues that we will find it difficult to find agreement on. For example, Europe insists on regulating American tech giants and on creating a new tax regime, hopefully through the OECD, which will capture the value created in the cyberspace and level the playing field between goods and services in 3D and in cyber. So that's coming, but we also have huge interests in common to do with our joint problems and concerns about China.
Moving back to the election itself, in a speech from the White House in the early hours of yesterday morning, Donald Trump shattered yet another norm in US politics by making unsubstantiated claims about electoral fraud and about him being the victor of the election, even though many millions of votes were still to be counted, in fact, are still to be counted. Do you believe that, given his remarks yesterday morning, given his remarks well before that, are the basic tenets of American democracy at risk?
Well, President Trump has been lying every day for the last 4 years, so nothing new. And of course, he, understand the man. He's under stress. If he's no longer the president, there are some prosecutors waiting to file charges against him for tax fraud and beyond. So yes, he will fight this tooth and nail. He will not concede, I don't think, because the non-presidential future for him is grim.
Well, let's see. Maybe he has a future in reality television. We don't know, but we have to await the votes being counted in Pennsylvania and so on. So it might take some time. Ahead of the election, much of the media coverage was on how, or that I saw at least, was on how in the election the stage was being set for the repudiation of Donald Trump. This certainly has not happened. In fact, I believe he has gotten roughly 5 million more votes than in the election 4 years ago. He will be getting not half of the votes, but probably, 48% of the votes by the time everything has been counted. Even if he does not occupy the White House after the 20th of January, do you think that Trumpism, if I can call it that, is here to stay?
Well, Trumpism is a global phenomenon. Populism, political entrepreneurs setting people against one another, pretending that complex problems can be easily solved, and calling their competitors traitors and outside of the national tribe. This is nothing particularly original. We have the same kind of politics all over Europe as well. But I'm just glad that it's ceasing to work.
As I mentioned, Mr. Sikorski, at the beginning of the interview, you're a former journalist. You mentioned just a moment ago about how Mr. Trump has been lying every day over the past 4 years. The Washington Post, in fact, has documented 25,000 false or misleading statements, claims by President Trump. Indeed, Twitter has now started flagging the US president's tweets as misleading, which is quite a turn of events. Do you fear that this legacy of disinformation emanating from the most powerful office in the world, in the White House, do you think that this legacy will outlast his presidency if he doesn't remain in the White House after January?
Only if we do nothing about the ecosystem which made the lying and the polarization so effective politically. And the ecosystem is, first of all, media's obsession with a good quote and with setting people against one another, and with the algorithms in social media that are set to polarize people, to capture their attention, to get them hooked on sitting in front of a laptop, and a lot of people making a lot of money out of destroying our democracy. We need to do something about it, because this has been a very close shave with a real disaster.
It's often said that where America leads, the rest of the world follows. When it comes to polarization and populism, what we have seen in the United States in recent times, how do you think Europe compares?
I don't think America will lead on this, because the US Congress is captured already by business interests. And I think there is a unique responsibility on Europe to try to regulate how social media operate in a democracy, what the rules of writing of these algorithms are, and beyond that, also how this activity is taxed.
Of course, in these elections, in Tuesday's elections, the US have not only been choosing a president, they've also been electing governors, state legislators, but more importantly for us, the 35 US senators who are up for election this time round, and the 435 seats in the House of Representatives. Can you tell us a little bit about the cooperation between us in the European Parliament and our counterparts in the US Congress?
Well, just earlier today, I held another meeting of the delegation for relations between EU and the US, and we engaged with a New York Times journalist, Stephen L. Lange, who gave us his take on the election. I'm happy to say that my opposite number in the US Congress, Jim Costa, is also on the way to keeping his seat. I hope we will be able to meet in 3D, because we still haven't had a chance. And of course, it's a bipartisan group also on the other side of the Atlantic. I think we can contribute to the exchanging of views and of information. I don't exaggerate the extent of our influence, but there are issues that are in common. For example, I was very glad to realize that the European Parliament proved to be a better setup for remote work than US Congress. We were able to quickly get into gear in remote meetings, and I believe remote voting is actually more efficient than voting in person. And I think we should keep some of these precedents even after the pandemic.
So not even in terms of policy, there's also exchanges that can happen in terms of one side learning from the other. I'd like to read some comments from LinkedIn. We have a comment from Dimitrios, who says it is important for EU member states to re-establish fruitful and substantial cooperation with the US on vital issues such as migration and border protection. While Christian Moos asks about trade, he says, how long will it take until there are new negotiations on a new TTIP? Is Biden likely to reopen these talks anytime soon? To remind people, TTIP was the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, I think. Do you think we'll be seeing a revival of TTIP or something similar?
I hope so, but let's not imagine that somehow a new president will change American parameters or the chief negotiators' instructions, because important business interests are at stake on both sides of the Atlantic. These are always very detailed and very difficult negotiations, as the British are learning to their cost recently.
I'd like to read some more comments from Instagram this time. Briac Milon on Instagram says that my view is that Biden shall win and that transatlantic relations should be based on democratic values. Matthias in the Czech Republic says, hopefully Biden wins, otherwise EU-US relations will continue to get worse. Solveig in Lyon, he says, the election probably won't have much of an impact on transatlantic relations, while Alberto in Spain says, it doesn't matter who wins, the US is our ally, so we must fight common threats together. While Teresa in Porto, she says, the EU and US need to get back on the same page as quickly as possible. Perhaps the most foreboding comment comes from Andrzej Gliwiński in Poland. He says, the results will be next year. Then we'll see. So maybe, in fact, we're having this interview too soon. Maybe we should come back to it in December or January. Who knows?
I don't think the results will take that long. I think we'll know pretty soon. But I disagree that the change of president will have no impact, because if we have President Biden who doesn't want to fight a two-front war, as a former defense minister, let me tell you, that's a bad idea. If Joe Biden recognizes that he needs Europe, he needs democratic allies to persuade China to mend its ways in the way that it treats our investors and the way it takes advantage of the international trading system, then we can be much more effective together. And I think Joe Biden has it in him to do that.
Final question, Mr. Sikorski, as I know you have a busy afternoon coming up. The period between US elections can often feel rather short. It'll just be maybe 2 years from now, we will already be entering into probably primary season again. 4 years from now, when we have the next presidential elections, what is your vision of the world? How would you like things to have changed? What's your vision, particularly of transatlantic relations?
By some measures, China is already the largest economy. In 4 years' time, it'll probably be even more obvious. China is rebuilding what it feels is the natural state of affairs, which is being surrounded by vassal states, but that hits against the American system of alliances. So we need mature, serious leaders, both in Washington and in Beijing, to manage that relationship. I hope that we on our European side get serious in that time on having a foreign policy and defense policy worthy of their names.
Dziękuję bardzo, Mr. Sikorski. Hopefully we can continue the discussion maybe early next year and see how things have developed. Do widzenia for now. Thank you to all of those on LinkedIn and Facebook who sent in their comments and questions. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks. Stay safe.